who's tuning in to the annual Symposium 2020, to our virtual panel of women's rights activists entitled Never Go Back, Afghan Women's Rights in the Unfolding Intra-Afghan Talks. My name is Natasha Fernando. I'm one of the board members of this organization, and I'm so pleased today to get the opportunity to introduce to you and interview our panelist, Sahar Halaimzai. She is an Afghan British rights advocate, writer, and human rights campaigner. Up until recently, she was the global head of campaigns and communications for the worldwide literary organization PEN International. Sahar's work has focused on bringing the voices of marginalized and silenced individuals and communities to center stage. In 2018, she received the inaugural London Writers' Award and is now working on her first book. She was recently appointed as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in the US, where her work focuses on human rights in Afghanistan. And in 2019, as if all of that wasn't impressive enough, she co-founded and today leads the Afghan campaign Time for Real Peace to counteract the exclusion of Afghan women, civil society, and minorities from peace negotiations. So once again, I'd like to welcome Sahar, and over to you. We'd love for you to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. That was perfect. Thanks so much. It's really great to be here.
Thank you. Wonderful. So let's just jump into the questions because I'm sure we have such a rich conversation ahead of us. So Sahar, overall, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic regarding the current state of the peace process?
The entire peace process, or the announcement of the talks between the US and the Taliban back in February 2019, generated a lot of anxiety in Afghanistan because of the secretive and exclusive nature of the talks. It's positive now that we're at a stage where the Afghan government is sitting down and talking directly with the Taliban to see whether they are truly committed to peace, or whether they are there to simply expel the Americans from Afghanistan. It's critically important to have a political process and to address grievances, but we also have to account for the other factors that drive conflict in Afghanistan, such as criminal, regional, and personal interests. Even at the stage of the talks, which is focused on determining the rules and procedures of the negotiations, we're already seeing some substantive issues emerging, whether it is the Taliban's insistence on an Islamic jurisprudence that is not shared by all Afghans, or if we look at the levels of violence that is being waged on the ground. Just yesterday, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission released a report expressing significant concern about the targeted killings of civilians. And this is a new trend, really, in Afghanistan, the targeting of civic leaders, journalists, artists, public servants. And these aren't just military targets or about maximizing territorial gains for leverage at the table. This is to instill fear, specifically by targeting young leaders and reformers who have a different vision for Afghanistan. A question that has been often raised, and I think it's an important one, is, was this the only way to get the Taliban to the negotiating table? Could it have been done without weakening the Republican side or excluding all other actors? Another important fact that I think is often lost in these conversations is the demand for peace existed and was happening in Afghanistan long before the Americans started talking to the Taliban. It began with the 2018 ceasefire, or earlier than that with the Kabul process, with the Afghan people marching from Helmand with war victims. What really gives me optimism is the Afghan people's indisputable desire for peace and their continued work for peace.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. I mean, that's just, it's very important that we know, that we try and grasp all the different pieces that are in play right now, and just how those interactions, you know, um, um, just move the process forward. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. What outcomes do you personally want from a peace process for Afghanistan?
I think I, along with the majority of Afghans, want an end to the armed conflict. It's generally civilians. For anyone who's paying attention to what's happening in Afghanistan, it's generally civilians who bear the brunt of the war. Just today, a suicide bomb went off in one of the provinces in Nangarhar in Afghanistan, killing 15 civilians, wounding 40 others, some of them children. Often these are life-changing injuries. Um, but I think any decision that tries to end conflict by installing a predatory order will create new dynamics and cycles of violence. If we have a deal that's only between, the strong men, the extremists, and the warlords, we're not going to see an end to conflict. And by incentivizing violence as a means to gaining access to resources and power over the head of the 95% of the population of Afghanistan, all we're doing is just looking at more war. And that's why it's so important that the Afghan public actually have a say in building and shaping their future. And Afghans have been very, very clear about what they want. They want a sustainable end to war, and one that creates pathways to more rights, to equality, to justice. We know that marginalization, exclusion, oppression, all of these things drive conflict and violence. And I often find it quite frustrating having these conversations when, the way that people talk about equal rights being a Western import. Most Afghans believe in a participatory system of governance where everyone is equal and protected by the law. Most also believe in preserving and expanding women's rights. But unfortunately, the pushback against women mobilizing, calling for representation in these talks, calling for equality, has not only come from the usual suspects, it hasn't only come from the Taliban, it's also come from some in the international community. A lot of these women have stood up publicly to defend their rights, to defend the gains of the last 20 years. And instead of being supported and encouraged by everyone, sometimes they are painted as elitist, as spoilers to peace, as lazy or unwilling to do the hard work for themselves and fight their own battles. And Afghan women are stuck in this, between these two very sort of impossible narratives. On the one hand, there is this narrative that the women who are mobilizing are elitist and therefore not representative of the broader Afghan population. And on the other hand, there is this narrative that those who aren't mobilizing won't really miss the basic rights that might be taken away from them because they never had them to begin with. So, what never had before, so what are they going to miss? And of course, the same questions of representation are never asked of the Taliban or any other parties for that matter. So Afghan women are up against, quite a lot in this, in the last 2 years, and not just in Afghanistan, but abroad as well, including this pretty entrenched narrative of, how they should behave, what their behavior means. So one of the outcomes that I really hope for, and I have so much faith because these women are so courageous and so hardworking, is that they are protected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's you mentioned that this shouldn't be just about the strong men's voices, and also when these women are there, they are leading the way, but then there's this pushback in terms of how they're being viewed. So with these conflicting issues or tensions in mind, are all parties actually at the table? And do you feel so far that this is an inclusive peace process?
I mean, so far it has been anything but inclusive. But now that the intra-Afghan talks have started, the government side has been pushed to being more inclusive. But of course, they have to accommodate the warlords, which leaves little space for others. There are 4 women on the Afghan negotiating team. But we have to remember that the push for minimal inclusion of women in civil society is only put on one party, on only 50% of the negotiating table. There is no similar push for diversity or inclusion on the Taliban side. There has been little pressure on them to do things differently. And I think more importantly, there has been no attempt at creating an independent space for civil society, for women, for victims of war to input into the talks or influence the agenda. And I think that there's a lot of work still to be done on that front.
Okay. Thank you for that. I mean, there's just so much to unpack there as well. I'll just take us in a different direction for a bit. There have been rumors that a possible concession to be made to the Taliban's views on girls' education is to limit female education in some ways. Whether it's cutting off education after primary school so they don't proceed beyond that. Is there any truth to these claims?
I mean, there has been a lot of speculation on what the Taliban will concede to. There's also been a lot of wishful thinking. But I think that we have enough data from what's happening on the ground, rather than speculating, we can actually look at areas that are under Taliban control. And I think, it is, one would assume that the Taliban, since the start of the talks, there would be an incentive for them to garner legitimacy by moderating some of their behavior. But recent reports demonstrate that areas under Taliban control, the rate of young girls going to school has dramatically decreased. In August, the Taliban in one of the provinces in Afghanistan, in Badakhshan, prevented some 200 young girls from sitting entry exams for university. And a decision that was, widely protested against by rural men, by the fathers of these girls who wanted their daughters to take the exams. I emphasize on the rural side because often outside commentators make a distinction suggesting that, basic rights for women and girls, such as education, is an urban desire. It is not something that is shared by rural communities, and that's just simply not true. We can also, there's also been reports that in provinces where Taliban rule, they've already started taking measures to limit freedom by banning music, for example, or banning mobile phones. So far, they have demonstrated very little shift in their views towards women, which obviously includes women's rights, women's and girls' access to education. And any concession on this issue will lead to more conflict. I often hear people say the sentence that Afghanistan today is not the same country as it was 20 years ago. But I think what people don't always fully grasp in terms of what that means is that the Taliban would not be able to enforce these rules now on a countrywide scale without extensive and increased violence. So I think it's really important to remember that.
With those points that you've just raised in mind, what can we as Canadians do to help ensure women's rights are protected during and after the peace process?
I think it's really crucial to continue to provide access and space for different voices when talking about what's happening in Afghanistan. This is very much a male debate, and not just in Afghanistan, but at the international level too. I work a lot with Afghan women, with experts, with, who are leaders in their field, who don't always get the space on the international side. If you want really good analysis of what's happening on the ground, if you want alternative ideas, you go to the front line, speak to the people who know what this all looks like close up. And that doesn't mean just talking to the Taliban or dismissing urban women as out of touch elitist when they're very much under attack and fighting for their basic rights. I think it's also important to understand that women's issues are indivisible from other issues at the table, that is, at the negotiating table. You can't protect women's rights without protecting the institutions that afford them those rights under the law. Security is a women's rights issue, especially when women are the targets. So supporting those key institutions that uphold some level of security, the Constitution, which grants women and other minorities protection, is really essential at this juncture.
And thank you. I mean, that's really such an important call to action and call to attention for like us in Canada. And what you're saying is applicable, across the board. It's true. You can't extract women's rights from the wider conversation, and you shouldn't as well.
Absolutely. And I think any attempt at doing that should be questioned. Whose interest does it serve to pigeonhole women's rights as an elitist ask? Why should women's rights be the first thing that is traded away at the negotiating table? And more importantly, what does that actually mean for conflict, for security? How will that then drive further violence and conflict?
And I think that's an important question to ask, not only in this context, but in really any sort of peace or international community context. So for you, what is the single most important thing you'd ask of the international community to support Afghanistan during the peace negotiation stage?
I think I'd ask for two things. Firstly, I would ask that the process is given reasonable time. I think rushing this deal would be a huge mistake. It took 18 months for the US-Taliban agreement to be concluded. The Afghan conflict is complex, it's multidimensional. There will be a lot of challenging issues that need to be discussed and hashed out at the negotiating table, and that takes time. I think it's also important to remember that Afghanistan is seeing near unprecedented levels of violence, which is already saying a lot. They have one of the poorest healthcare systems in the world, and they're battling COVID, which has crippled some of the most sophisticated healthcare systems in the world. They have one of the largest refugee populations, internally displaced people in the world. And these are all connected to what happens at the negotiating table and beyond. Support from the international community to continue to support the institutions that provide basic security and basic services for the Afghan people as these negotiations continue is really key here. We know from past experience that in Afghanistan, one of the greatest dangers for the country is if the security forces collapse. So we have to make sure that those institutions are supported. I think I want to make one more point. When talking about Afghanistan, people often ignore the context and suffer from historical memory loss. Today we often talk about what's happening in Afghanistan, about this peace process as a pathway to end the 40-year civil war. And yes, Afghanistan is fighting a civil war, but it's also a proxy war. It's a regional war. It's an international war. And understanding that history and understanding that language matters because it influences policy. The internationalized nature of this war suggests that we need to look at other regional and international aspects that drive violence in this conflict. And on the flip side, there is this narrative that Afghanistan is beyond reform it has always been a violent country, you know, and these things are simply not true, and just help perpetuate this narrative that this is simply an Afghan problem. So I think being aware of that, you know, that it isn't simply an Afghan problem, and continued international support to the Afghan people and those key institutions is really important at this, you know, as they navigate their way through this moment in their history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, it really resonates, you know, with me about how damaging the incorrect narrative can be. You know, when all eyes are on a particular situation, if it isn't being couched in accurate, respective, inclusive terms, you know, it's just yet another hurdle in everything that you're trying to accomplish.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, it's really important. You know, I find it disheartening sometimes when I hear, you know, experts and historians talk about Afghanistan in these terms, and talk about this process, and particularly, you know, when we're talking about what could possibly be traded away at the negotiating table, to talk about it as if, well, Afghan women won't really miss these rights because rural women haven't had it, or you know, that for me, I find that very discouraging and disheartening, because it really makes me realize what these women, what civil society, what this country is up against.
Yeah. No, and you know, I just want to thank you for all the, like, really the important points that you've raised through the questions, you know, that we've just gone through, and it just presents us with such a rich view and context, you know, of the current situation. And not only that, the questions we should be asking ourselves and pushing ourselves to think, you know, beyond what is being presented to us. You know, there's just so much more that we need to be paying attention to, things we need to be supporting, and things we need to just ensure that we're paying attention to. So maybe just as we wrap this up, you know, I would love to hear from you a bit more about your campaign, Time for Real Peace. If you'd like to share a bit more about that, or if you have other points that maybe you didn't get to expand upon, because I know we had like some questions to get through, but if you want to expand upon any, you know, I would be thrilled for you to do so.
Sure. I mean, I think when I first started, you know, my work on Afghanistan, the thing that really pushed me to do it was when I saw how few opportunities there were for Afghans to speak for themselves and to, you know, speak about what it's like to live in Afghanistan. And the more I started looking into that, the more I realized there's a huge gap between what is actually happening in Afghanistan. You know, it has a thriving art scene, a thriving civil society. You know, there's this group called the Helmand Peace Marchers, who are a peaceful group who began by marching with victims of war, who are completely neutral, asking all sides to end violence. And there is just so little of that gets through the conversations and the noise about Afghanistan. And it's so important to make space and room for Afghans to talk about what's happening, and Afghans to be in the room when we're discussing, you know, what our foreign policy should be, how you know, the best way to use resources, you know, who should be, you know, we should always question if there isn't an Afghan around the table when these conversations are being had, you know, more than one Afghan. I think that's the kind of questions we should be asking ourselves, because that's a problem. And that would be and that's really been the core of what I've been trying to do, is to elevate and amplify those voices of the people on the ground who are doing the most extraordinary work against the most unimaginable challenges and doing it well, doing it, Afghans have been peace building for decades. This is now part of the kind of global consciousness because of the talks, but Afghans have been doing this for decades, against a lot of outside interference and challenges and with very few resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just incredible. Just through my involvement with Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, just getting that extra insight into everything that's being done on the ground, with so much, not to say so much pushing against them, but just so much to overcome and contend with.
Absolutely. So maybe spend like 5 minutes Googling, what some of these really amazing groups and organizations are doing on the ground. I'll happily share a list with you after this.
Oh, please. Yeah. I'm sure we can like find a way to, convey that, because, it's true. I mean, you spoke so eloquently about participatory approaches and inclusion and the role of women in this, and narratives. And my takeaway is that there's so much richness, to this conversation, and there's so much drive and determination among the Afghan people themselves that this isn't a hopeless situation. This isn't
not at all. And I think it's important to question, who does it serve that's the narrative? Who does it serve that Afghanistan is beyond reform? It's a country that's violent. Its people are violent. And that's really, when you really think about it, it's, know anything about Afghanistan, that is, simply not true. So the question remains, who is it serving, that Afghanistan becomes this place that there's no point really investing in, or that deserves the chance to build a peaceful future. And those are really important questions.
Mm-hmm. So Sahar, I just wanted to ask for your thoughts. What do you see among the young people or the youth of Afghanistan, like the next generation?
I mean, the next generation really is what gives Afghanistan hope. They are so engaged, so active, just so plugged into what's happening in the rest of the world. We have a generation of entrepreneurs, artists, of musicians, of actors, of actresses, and they are really, driving the progress in the country. And again, which is why it's even more, I think, discouraging for Afghanistan as a country, that they've had such little say and such little space in this process that determines the outcome of their lives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just something really incredible and powerful for all of us to keep in mind, and it is very encouraging to hear everything that you've shared. So thank you Sahar, so much for the time you've taken for this panel. I would love to keep in touch as well, and I'm sure as an organization we would love further opportunities to hear from you as well.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been really lovely to talk to you.